2 servers were resetting the back table when the folding chairs came out, the good ones already claimed for the head tables, and it was Denny who saw it first, a brass key on a ring of 3 catching the light in the old man's pocket before Marisol Pennington's hand landed on his shoulder and turned him the other way. "She's putting him by the kitchen doors again," Denny said, snapping a cloth over a tray. "She does it every year," the other server said. Her name tag read, Corinne. "He's been coming to this thing longer than this hall's had air conditioning, and every year kitchen doors." Denny watched Marisol point the janitor toward a bare folding chair with the flat, practiced patience of a woman redirecting foot traffic. The old man didn't argue. He just nodded, the way a man nods at weather, and carried his own chair the last 10 feet himself, so nobody would have to. "You'd think somebody would say something," Corinne said. "Somebody probably has," Denny said. "Nobody with a badge, though. If you've ever watched someone erased from a record they built, sit with that a moment before the room figures it out. By the time the guests arrived in their good jackets and their careful corsages, Otis Fenno had already been in Harbor Light Hall for 3 hours, and none of them would have known it. He came in through the service entrance at 4 in the afternoon, same as always, wearing his gray uniform pressed into lines so clean they looked drawn with a rule, the patch over his breast pocket reading nothing but O. Fenno, no rank, no unit, no year. His left shoulder sat locked at table height, had for longer than he could easily reckon, and so he worked low and never reached above it, a habit so old it no longer registered to him as a limitation. He set chairs. He squared linens. He checked the sight lines from every angle a photographer might use, out of some old instinct for arcs of fire that had simply changed its target over the decades. In his trouser pocket, a ring carried 3 keys, and only one of them opened anything in this building. The second was to a house 40 minutes from here. The third had opened nothing in 53 years, was hand-filed brass, small enough to close inside a fist, a depth gauge calibration key his instructor had cut for him the week he made chief, back when the word chief still meant something you earned in a compartment full of water and not a title on a program nobody printed anymore. He moved through the tables with the ring shifting soft against his hip, and when he reached the head table, he stopped at the 3rd chair from the left, the one that would sit empty until the program called the honored guests forward, and he wiped it down twice, once with the cloth and once, lighter, with the flat of his palm, the way a man checks a rail he's about to trust his weight to. Nobody had asked him to do this. Nobody had ever asked him not to. He did it before the room filled and did it after the room emptied, and in 20-some years working this hall, he had never once explained it to anyone who asked, because nobody ever had. Marisol Pennington arrived at 5 with a laminated card clipped to her belt and the seating chart already fixed in her mind before she'd crossed the lobby. She was good at this. Nobody watching her work the first hour would have argued otherwise. A donor from the Shipbuilders Guild wanted his table moved off the draft from the side door, and she had him relocated inside 4 minutes, gracious the whole time. A widow whose husband's name had been misprinted on his memorial candle corrected it herself with a paint pen before anyone else even noticed the error. A retired captain, deaf in one ear, was reseated so his good side faced the podium, and she thanked him for telling her, rather than making him ask twice. Then she reached the F's on her master list, running her finger down laminated donor tiers, platinum, gold, service, guest, and found no line at all for Fenno O. "You're not on any list," she told him, not unkindly, checking twice in case the card had smudged. "Do you have a table assignment from last year? A member number?" "No, ma'am," Otis said. "Then I have to put you where there's room," she said. And there was room by the kitchen doors, and that was that, as far as her card was concerned. Sawyer Nunnally, 24 and 6 weeks into the job, watched this exchange from behind a stack of programs and felt something pull tight behind her sternum that she didn't have a name for yet. "He's here every year," she said, quiet, not quite an objection. "Then he knows the drill," Marisol said, already moving to the next name. The dinner program ran on schedule, and Otis sat by the kitchen doors through 3 separate small cruelties that none of the people delivering them would have called cruel. A program usher, young and overworked, tried twice to wave him toward the exit before checking his badge and realizing he was staff, not a wandering guest, and reddened without apologizing. A photographer arranging a shot of surviving crew from the old squadron waved him out of frame with the flat of her hand, saying she needed just the honorees, and Otis stepped back so smoothly it looked like he'd been leaving the shot before she asked. A donor at a nearby table, 2 drinks in, asked his wife loud enough to carry who let the custodian sit so close to the stage, and Otis said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer, delivered with his spine straight and his eyes on the head table like a man reading a chart he already knew by heart. Only once did he correct anyone, and it was gentle. The usher, flustered, muttered that the layout made no sense, tables running against the old fire doors instead of the windows. Used to run the other way, Otis said, mild as weather. Before they widened the kitchen, window side was for smoke, not view. The usher blinked, filed it as trivia, and moved on. Sawyer stopped watching her clipboard sometime around the second course. She started watching him instead, the way he tracked the room without turning his head, the way his hand found the ring of keys in his pocket and settled, the stillness in him that wasn't absence but attention, like a man standing watch at a post nobody else could see. The toasts began at 8. Fleet Admiral Spencer Harrington, 74 years old, silver-headed and composed, rose to speak of the Cormorant Strait Squadron and the men who had crewed her, and he was 3 sentences into a story about a flooding casualty 53 years gone when he stopped mid-word, looked past the head table, past the donors, past Marisol Pennington standing with her card still raised, and started walking. He crossed the entire floor. Guests turned in their chairs to watch a fleet admiral walk the length of a banquet hall past his own place of honor, past the microphones still live and humming, past $300 a plate donors who had paid handsomely to be closer to him than this. Marisol's mouth was still open on the words she'd been about to say to him, something about the schedule, and it never finished. Harrington stopped at the folding chair by the kitchen doors. He looked down at the old man in the pressed gray uniform, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The whole hall gone so quiet, the kitchen's exhaust fan sounded like a tide. "Chief Fenno," he said. 2 words, nothing more. But the room heard the rank land on a man wearing a janitor's patch, and heard the Admiral's voice hold steady and certain, the way you'd address a superior, not a servant, and 300 people who had spent the evening not looking at Otis Fenno now could not look anywhere else. Marisol Pennington's laminated card hung forgotten at her side. Somewhere behind her, Sawyer Nunnally had gone completely still, watching the scene the way you watch something you'll be asked to describe later and know you won't get right. The quiet that followed Harrington's 2 words did not break so much as widen, spreading table to table until even the kitchen staff had stopped in the doorway with trays half raised. Otis Fenno stood, slow but sure, his bad shoulder holding its old line, and took the hand the Admiral offered him with both of his own. "Sir," Otis said, and nothing else, because nothing else was needed. Harrington turned to the room before Otis could sit back down, and though his voice carried the practiced calm of 40 years giving orders, something under it had gone unsteady. "This man kept me alive in a flooded engine room when I was 21 years old and too green to know how close I'd come," he said. "I have told that story at every reunion I've attended for 11 years, and until tonight, I did not know the man in it was in this building." Marisol Pennington found her voice, thin and correct even now. "Admiral, his name isn't on any list I've been given. I can move him to the head table immediately. I'll adjust." "Move him where the room can see him," Harrington said, not unkindly, but final. And it was Sawyer who was already dragging a chair from the nearest empty setting before anyone finished the sentence. The committee reconvened in the small office off the kitchen an hour later, after the program had limped through its remaining toasts on nerve alone, and it was there, under fluorescent light instead of chandelier glow, that the real trouble surfaced. Sawyer had pulled the archive boxes herself 3 years back, 5, finally 10, laying the old programs flat across the folding table like a hand of cards nobody wanted to see. Otis Fenno's name was in none of them. Not as a guest, not as crew, not in the small print under acknowledgments where the hall's own maintenance staff sometimes got a line of thanks. Sawyer went back further, into boxes that hadn't been opened since they were packed, and still found nothing, a quiet erasure so consistent it could not have been accident past the second year, let alone the 10th. "The print run locks in 3 days," Marisol said, mostly to herself, staring at the blank space where a name should have been for longer than she'd been alive. 600 copies, mailed to every member on the rolls. If we don't fix this before it locks, it's like tonight never. She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, because they all understood what tonight had been for 100 people who would never see it in writing. "We add him," she said, brightening slightly, reaching for her laptop. "A special guest line. Distinguished attendee this year's ceremony. I can get that typeset by tomorrow." Sawyer, still elbow deep in the oldest archive box, went quiet in a way that made Marisol look up. "What?" Marisol said. Sawyer held up a program from 11 years back, the ink faded but legible, a small printed note on the inside cover. "Special guest lines this year reflect updated donor recognition formatting, approved by the finance office." Below it, a single sentence any of them might have skipped past if they hadn't spent the last hour hunting for exactly this kind of language. "Enlisted personnel without current membership status will be listed under general recognition, rather than named individually, pending format review." "That's the same fix," Sawyer said. "That's the exact same fix you just offered him. Special guest. General recognition. It's not correcting the mistake, it's the nicer version of the same eraser." Marisol read it twice, and the color went out of her face by degrees, the way weather changes before a storm actually arrives, one small shift and then another. "This format is 9 years old," she said slowly. "I didn't write this. I inherited this. I've been running his tier sheet since I started, and I never once asked why enlisted names outside the paying rolls got folded into a group line." "Because nobody made you ask," Sawyer said, not cruelly. It was, in its way, the kindest thing anyone had said to her all night. Fleet Admiral Harrington had come to stand in the doorway sometime during this, still in his dress jacket, listening with the stillness of a man used to receiving bad reports without flinching. When Marisol turned to him, hopeful in the specific way of someone looking for a shortcut out of a mess she now understood she hadn't made alone, he shook his head before she'd finished asking. "I can't simply overrule this," he said. "I wish I could tell you rank fixes it. It doesn't. This tier format isn't a courtesy, it's a contract. Donor levels are tied to funding commitments the association signed 9 years ago, and changing the print structure without authorization breaks agreements with people who gave money expecting certain terms in return." He let that sit a moment, plainly unhappy with his own sentence. "The man who built this format is the only one withstanding to unbuild it before your deadline. Devin Cobbs, finance director, 9 years now. He designed the tier system you've been running off that laminated card." "He's not even here tonight," Marisol said. "No," Harrington said. "He rarely is." The office went quiet again, but it was a different quiet than the one that had followed his walk across the floor. Heavier, less clean, the kind that comes when a problem turns out to have a second floor beneath the one you thought you were standing on. Otis Fenno had said almost nothing since the toast, sitting near the doorway with his hands loose in his lap, the brass ring warm now from an hour in his pocket, listening to strangers argue over how to spell his name back into a history that had quietly spelled it out. "Somebody's going to have to call him," Sawyer said. "I will," Harrington said. "Tonight, if he'll take it. But he'll want to hear it from the man who was actually there before he authorizes anything." He looked toward Otis, and something passed between the two old men that needed no laminated card to explain. "Chief," Harrington said, "would you be willing to tell him what happened? Not for your name, for the others." Otis was quiet long enough that Marisol thought he might refuse. "I can tell him," Otis said. "Won't take long. Never does, telling the true part." The call came through on speaker in the small office a little after 11, Devin Cobbs picking up from his own kitchen 3 states away, his voice carrying the particular caution of a man who senses, before anyone explains anything, that this call is going to cost him something. "Mr. Cobbs, this is Fleet Admiral Spencer Harrington," the Admiral said, and gave him 30 seconds of context, spare and exact, the print deadline, the missing names, the format review from 9 years back with his own signature line beneath it. Then he said, "I have someone here who'd like to speak with you directly," and passed the phone to Otis without ceremony. Otis held it the way he held most things, steady, unhurried, his bad shoulder square. "Mr. Cobbs," he said. "Name's Otis Fenno. Chief Petty Officer, Engineering and Damage Control, 24 years. 53 years back, I was below decks on the Cormorant Strait Squadron when we took a flooding casualty in the aft compartment. 7 of us worked that space in the dark, chest deep before we were done. And one of the men we pulled out breathing was a lieutenant, 21 years old, name of Spencer Harrington." He let that settle a moment before going on. 6 other names were in that compartment with me that night. Wasn't one hero down there. Was 7 men doing a job nobody wanted, and every one of them earned the same line in a program, if a program's going to exist at all. On the other end, Devin Cobbs said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the caution and found something rawer underneath it. "I built that donor tier format to save the association's funding after a bad year," he said. "I told myself dropping unaffiliated enlisted names to a group line freed up space and kept the big donors happy, and it worked, and I never went back and looked at what it actually cost because nobody made me look." A breath, audible even through the phone. "I didn't know there was a Chief Fenno behind that policy. I didn't know there was anybody. That's the whole problem, isn't it? I made it so I'd never have to know." "You don't owe me a name in bigger letters than anybody else's," Otis said. "Owe the other 6 the same size type you'd give a man who wrote a check. That's the whole ask. Never wanted to be the name people remember. Wanted the names that got dropped put back where they were before somebody decided a spreadsheet was worth more than a roster." There was a photograph nobody in that office could see, propped on Otis Fenno's kitchen windowsill 40 minutes away, of 7 young men in dungarees squinting into harbor light, and there was a second chair at his kitchen table that had sat empty every launch dinner night for 8 years running, since the evening Winifred Fenno stopped setting the table herself, and Otis took up the habit in her place, laying out 2 settings every year on the date the squadron used to muster for its launch dinner, one for himself and one that he never once filled, cleared the same night untouched, kept the way she'd have kept it had she lived to keep it herself. He had never told anyone why he still did it. Winifred had been the one who remembered every one of those men's names before he did some years, the one who kept the calendar, the one who said, more than once, that a name written down was a debt paid, and a name left off was a debt someone chose not to pay. He had buried her 8 years ago and kept her ledger going without her, quietly, the way he did most things that mattered. "I'll authorize the correction tonight," Cobbs said. "All of it. Every year I can pull records for. It'll cost the association some donor conversations I'm not looking forward to. That's mine to have, not yours." "Appreciate it," Otis said, and handed the phone back to Harrington, and that was the whole of his testimony, given once, plainly, and never repeated. The reprint order went out 2 mornings later, ahead of the deadline by the better part of a day, 600 copies carrying, for the first time in 9 years, a full roster of enlisted names in the same plain type as every donor line above them. Otis Fenno's among them, no larger, no smaller, exactly the size he'd asked for. Marisol Pennington spent that same evening at her kitchen table, rewriting the committee's coordinator handbook from the first page, striking the donor tier language from the seating protocol entirely, and replacing it with a single new rule. Every attendee is seated by service, not by contribution, and any name absent from the roster is a question to be answered, not a placement to be assumed. She kept her laminated card in the end, but she never clipped it to her belt again. Some names never made it onto the page the first time. Say who you're still making sure gets counted. A year turned over quietly after that, the way years do when the loud part of a story is finished and only the living of it remains. Harbor Light Hall filled again for another reunion and emptied again the way it always did. And when the last guest had gone and the lights along the head table had been dimmed to half, Otis Fenno was there in his pressed gray uniform folding chairs down the center aisle, one at a time, the ring of 3 keys shifting soft in his pocket with each stack he carried. Inside the supply closet door, taped where only a man who opened that door every working night would ever see it, hung a single page torn from this year's reprinted program, 600 names run in identical type, his own no louder than any other. He closed the closet, tested the latch out of old habit, and stood a moment in the empty hall with the brass calibration key warm in his palm, the way it had been warm in another man's palm 53 years before him. and then he turned off the lights and went home to a house with two chairs still set at the table, one of them, as always, empty.